the variety of risk has been exploding. We used to look at risk under the financial lens, uh, but we now have operational risk, ESG risk, cyber threats. So all these things are becoming more and more diverse. And so you need proper data and accurate data to reflect on that.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Sustainable Supply Chain Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I've got my special guest, Pierre. Pierre, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me today. I'm Pierre Laprée. I'm the Chief Product Officer at SpendHQ. Prior to that, I was the founder and the CEO of a procurement tech company called Perangusta that merged with SpendHQ 3 years ago. And prior to that, I was the deputy of the global chief procurement officer for the Adecco Group, the staffing company, in which I had multiple remits, including sustainable procurement. And I'm now based out of Atlanta, Georgia, in the US.
Okay, the capital of supply chain. Fair enough.
Absolutely.
So, for people who might be unaware, Pierre, can you tell us what is SpendHQ?
Yes, SpendHQ is a solution provider that provides solutions in terms of spend intelligence and procurement performance management. What we help our client do is get a sense for how much they spend, with whom, where, almost in real time. So we cater for extremely large organizations that can sometimes have tens, if not hundreds of ERP systems, and we help them consolidate that spend data, and we help them surface insights or patterns that will indicate them where they should look to look for optimization or reducing the risk around their supply chain. The other part of the solution, performance management, is about putting these insights in motion, because the best insight you have needs to be actioned upon. And that's what we do. We're a kind of Salesforce, but for procurement organization. You build a pipeline of sourcing and procurement projects. You help the team make sure that they follow up, progress at the right pace, provide visibility to the organization on how things are going, and more importantly, on the impact you're delivering for the organization. Some of the impact will be financials, for example, savings, but there's also and more non-financial impact. So we help our client track the improved cost after a sourcing project, but also the impact on the carbon footprint of the reduction in energy or water consumption. So whatever impact procurement wants to show and demonstrate to the organization, we can help them track that, financial or non-financial.
Okay. Talk to me, because this is the Sustainable Supply Chain Podcast. Talk to me about the sustainability wins that you can get for your clients who are using SpendHQ.
So we help our clients win in two aspects. First, we give them visibility on where they are in sustainable procurement. We help them understand the emission linked to their spend, so the scope 3 emissions, and we are very accommodating for our clients. A lot of them don't have necessarily a lot of good data, but we can already help them with category-based carbon footprint calculations. We can also help get down to supplier level carbon footprint emission. And for the more mature, we can go down to activity-based carbon footprint calculation. X number of products at X kilograms of CO2 equivalent. We help them scale that total carbon footprint based on their spend information and their actual consumption. So that's for the, I would say, environmental part. We also help them understand how diverse their supply base is. So we partner with companies like supplier.io to enrich their supplier information and say, hey, in these categories, you're leading the benchmark by having, I don't know, 13% of your spend with diverse supplier. Here you're lagging. So maybe you need to increase the amount of spend you're doing with diverse suppliers. And we help them identify such suppliers. So this first part of establishing a baseline when it comes to sustainable procurement is really hard. And a lot of people don't know where to start. We help them with this. And we help them set themselves on the path to increase. The first assessment might be a bit coarse, not very precise, but it helps get the ball rolling in their organization and surface the data to generate interest with the C-suite. We help our clients win when the CEO or the CFO say, oh, that's interesting, but how do we get better? How do we get more granular data? And that generally unlocks mandate and budget to actually go deeper and get to better, more structured, more detailed data around supply chain and diversity or ESG. So that's one aspect, is establishing a baseline, because the baseline is then how you build the plan. And the plan is identifying projects, identifying the levers you can pull, identifying the impact you expect. And that's where the performance management side steps in. What we've seen is that a lot of people make a carbon footprint assessment, for example,
Mhm.
and they say, hey, we're going to reduce that by 15% by year end. And what happens most of the time is that they wait until December 31st of the year to say, oh, well, we got to 10%. That's not that bad. So the problem is that there is this kind of disconnect between goal setting and impact measurement at the end of the year. And what we help them is actually keep track of that. I like to say that salespeople are the more mature here, because they have a target.
Mhm.
They know how much they close at the end of the year, but they have something extremely important in the middle, that is the rolling forecast. It's how well are we doing so far? Are we on track with the plan? The groundbreaking things we're bringing to our clients is giving them a way to see if they are on the right track to reach those objectives, and course correct if they are not. Because you might only have reached 50% of the goal in the middle of the year, and you might say, that's okay. But if you don't have enough projects left in your pipeline to close the gap, you're in a bad shape. Or if all your projects are geared toward the end of the year, you're probably in a good shape. But how do you know if you don't have the data, if you don't have the tool to identify opportunities, set targets, track the progress, and measure the results? So that's really how it should be done. I mean, sustainable procurement should be like sales. It's something you actively track and course correct when needed, and on which you need to provide progress reports, transparency, and auditability into what you're claiming you're bringing to the party.
Great. And what about the topic of supplier risk? Is that one that you work with your clients on as well?
Absolutely. So supplier risk, I would say it was almost an afterthought a few years ago, but probably in the past 5 years, this has taken center stage in procurement. So it's again a matter of having a baseline, understanding where your current level of risk is and what you can do about that. What is a bit different with risk, especially in the past few years, is that the variety of risk has been exploding. We used to look at risk under the financial lens, but we now have operational risk, ESG risk, cyber threats. So all these things are becoming more and more diverse. And so you need proper data and accurate data to reflect on that. If you look at financial risk, a lot of people will tell you, yeah, probably 30 to 40% of our supplier might be exposed to some sort of financial risk. When you expand the scope of how you consider risk, what we've seen in a few studies is that more than 80, almost 90% of the company have said they're facing supply risk in their supply base. So it's everywhere. And so it's different types of risk, but it's more frequent risks. The pace at which those adverse events have materialized is just increasing. And they're hitting you more often, and you have less and less time to react, and you have less and less time between two events. So it means that you need to build that muscle to be able to react quickly. So absolutely, risk is becoming center stage, and we help our clients with getting a complete picture of where they stand, but also giving them a tool to prioritize the risk and make sure that those that require an action, well, they are executed upon.
Okay. And talking about risk, what kind of risks are keeping procurement leaders up at night these days?
I would say financial risk is one, because they are an existential threat to a supplier, and a supplier that might be critical. So if your supplier goes bankrupt, well, it means supply chain interruption for you. So that's one of the most important risks. But what we've seen is that cyber threats, cyber risk, are also becoming increasingly important, and for two reasons. First, they can disrupt your supply chain, but they can also become a very big liability on your own business. Because if one of your suppliers is leaking data that maybe leaking your own data, but it might actually be leaking data from your own clients. So this creates a massive ripple effect of a small supplier of software might leak data. That's the butterfly effect. It's the effects are much bigger than the cause. So cyber threat is rising at an alarming rate. And you've probably heard of those recent events where we were talking about the supply chain hacks. So the solar wind issue where actually the provider of network devices was hacked, cascading the risk down to their client and then having ripple effect everywhere in the world. So you need to be in front of those risks. You may or may not avoid them, but what you need to be is prepared. You will not prevent a risk from happening. Your mandate, your duty in procurement is how do we reduce the time it takes to see the risk, react to the risk, and close the gap. So it's not so much more about avoiding the risk, is how fast can you react.
Sure. And what about other risks then, like the risk of, let's say, there being forced labor somewhere in your supply chain, or that your suppliers are on a floodplain and there are heavy rains coming, or other those kind of risks?
Those are a lot surprisingly related to ESG. And that's very important because we used to see ESG as some kind of a feel good thing, say, hey, are we being good citizens? But not anymore, because forced labor, child labor, these kind of things, they are awful and they can have dramatic impact on the image of your organization. But when you think of this, in most of the countries, it's actually forbidden. So basically, you're engaging with a supplier that has unlawful practices, which means they can be forced to shut down. If they shut down, it means you're no longer with the supplier, meaning that you have downstream impact on your supply chain. So again, ESG is becoming increasingly an operational risk more than an image risk. And what you hint at, the climate risk, I mean, probably have stopped counting the number of major climate events that have interrupted supply chains or disrupted operations on in one country, on one factory. So you can no longer ignore that. And I remember back in the days when I was in procurement, we were outsourcing our data centers. And one of the things we started paying attention were climate risk. Are we subject to flooding? Are we subject to drought that would impact the cooling of the servers and these kind of things? And then you start talking about lanes to make sure that the plane is not likely to fall on your data center. So these kind of things are actually more and more prevalent, and procurement people need to realize these things are out there and can have an impact. And the problem is, it's already hard enough to do that on your tier one supplier, so the supplier you directly interact with. How can you go down the supply chain with your tier two, tier three, tier N suppliers? You can no longer ignore that because, yeah, there will be a flood, there will be a tsunami, there will be a hurricane, and this will impact you one way or another.
And there's also increasing legislation as well that companies have to comply with in this space. I mean, one of the other ones that I didn't mention was deforestation, and there's the new EUDR legislation, for example, which you don't want to be tripping over either.
Yeah, and I would say that regulations are actually a good thing because there were the early adopters who did this because they believed it was the right thing to do. They believed it would increase their performance as an organization. Regulation is just a way to bring everybody to jump on the bandwagon and actually do what's right. I'm French, and there was these compliance laws in France where, for example, if your suppliers were not paying social charges, so I would put that in the field of governance or proper ways of doing business, you could actually be sued and cover a part of the expenses that your supplier did not pay. So regulation are a good way to push yourself to improve your practices, but also to make sure that you're pushing that a bit upstream in your supply chain to ensure that you're working with the right people. And what we've seen with our most mature clients is that they actually help their suppliers become better because it's hard. You need structure, you need process, you need education, you need data. And especially with the bigger Fortune 500 clients, they do that very well, and they can upskill their suppliers, their smaller suppliers, to do all of that. So regulation for that, I believe, are actually good. So it may not be the common or shared assessment of whether regulations are good, but I do believe it actually moves the needle to do the right things. And typically one of the things where regulation is hard for our clients is there are all these lists of sanctioned organizations or sanctioned individuals, and with the war in Ukraine, the amount of sanctions all over the place has exploded. So how do you know whether you're doing business with a company that has shareholders that are on a sanctioned individual list? Getting that data is really hard, and we're fortunate to work with a few partners who can help us with this, because in the end, it's another facet of risk that we can bring to the puzzle for our clients is, hey, you have this big supplier, financial risk, ESG risk, cyber threat, they're good, but hey, there's something shady in the shareholder structure for that supplier. So you may want to have a look, because that could be exposure for you. Is it bad? Does it need to be taken care of? How quickly? That's the kind of thing to help our clients figure out by bringing all this supplier risk data into the mix.
Yeah, and being topical as we are right now, talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impacts of that, there's also other geopolitical things in flux. We have tariffs as well. Are companies starting to rethink their global sourcing strategies, do you think, off the back of that?
So they are thinking about doing this. Absolutely. The question is, how do they do that? What we're seeing with a lot of our clients is that they don't have the data to do that, because you might have a relatively basic view of, hey, how much am I buying from Canadian supplier when I'm in the US? And the problem is that the issue around tariffs is a lot more complex than that. First, you don't care so much about the country of your supplier, but rather on the country of origin of whatever you're buying from them. Because that may be a Canadian supplier, but you might be buying from a plant in Mexico, which still is an issue. And a lot of people tend to forget about that in procurement. There is this notion of HTS, the harmonized tariff system. Within a procurement category, not everything will be subject to tariffs, or not to the same extent. And so how do you get data that is granular enough, mapped to that HTS taxonomy, to actually measure the impact of what you're doing? Only when you have that baseline of data can you start making decisions on, hey, should I relocate? How big is the impact, and how urgently do I need to relocate my supply chain? But that's very hard, because a lot of clients cannot even get a hold of that granular level of data. And again, we can help them. We cannot invent data that is not there, but we can help put everything in perspective and get them the holistic view of knowing where they need to act and how quickly.
Okay. And I mean, speaking of data, we are swimming in it these days. What does it take to turn that into meaningful action in supplier risk?
I would say there are two parts. There is a technical aspect of being able to inject data as real time as possible, to make sense of the data, to normalize it, to consolidate it, and to mine it for insights. But there's one thing where we still rely on the client, and again, we can help them with that, is depending on who you are and the categories you're buying, risk may have a different shape. And so for some clients, a supplier risk would be 40% of financial factors, 30% of cyber threats, and the remainder for ESG risk. But in some categories, for example, if you're buying chemical, the ESG factors might actually be 80% of the risk factor you want to consider. So that's how we help our client get a better understanding of what the risk is getting this kind of composite risk score that builds upon different risk components. So to go back to your question, there's a lot of data out there. We can help enrich the data, clean the data, consolidate the data, but determining what is the right blend of risk factors into the overall risk score of your supplier or your supply chain, that's where we work hand in hand with our clients, and where the technology can help put things in motion and blend all of that together.
Okay, and what about the trade-off then between the need for fast decisions and the need for deep due diligence?
that's actually a good one. Where we're helping our client is having a baseline assessment across the board. And as you say, it may not be perfect, but at least it will surface the biggest outliers, the elephant in the room. Uh, but then the question is what actually matters. And one of the situations we had with a client recently is that a small $40,000 supplier, when they have suppliers in millions or tens of millions of dollars, a $40,000 supplier was actually causing a major disruption risk in their supply chain because they provide something that was not very costly, but that was critical in their supply chain. And so when you start seeing financial risk on that small supplier, because they're a small supplier, so they don't have a lot of room for maneuvering in terms of cash, you need to be super careful of that. So that's one thing where we help our clients state that risk profile depending on the type of supplier, the type of risk, the type of category they're buying from, to say, hey, this might be a small spend supplier, but you better check carefully this and that aspect because down the road, this can have major impact on your supply chain. So that's exactly where we're helping our clients is not all risks or not all suppliers are created equal. Risk factors are one thing, spend are another thing, but the impact on the business is another. And we always tell our clients when they need it to think in terms of impact on the business. But if you just take the notion of risk at face value in absolute terms, you will just exhaust yourself because there's so much risk out there. So if you start factoring in the impact on your business, you might realize that what may look in absolute term as a high risk category or a high risk supplier, well, actually you don't care so much if there's a disruption. I mean, if your stationary supplier goes belly up, even though it's a $5 million expense every year, you probably don't care. Yeah, you tell the people to go to the corner shop and buy their pencils, and that will be a disruption, but it's not threatening your business. It's not a life emergency. So getting this client to think of risk in terms of a framework, in terms of what are my risk dimension and what is the business impact, and as a result, how do I need to account for high or low risk? That's also one way we can help our clients.
Okay. And of course, no conversation around supply chain and technology and data would be complete without a conversation around AI. So how can AI help in all this, or can it?
AI will have a lot of benefit because, I mean, let's face it, the amount of data we have available is just staggering. And the velocity of data, the pace at which new data is added is just accelerating. The human brain has stopped being functional or being helpful there, and AI has been helping a lot. So a few ways AI can be useful is in putting together the right flavors of AI and in the right order to actually get to a result. Because these days everybody is talking about generative AI, but that's just one tool in the toolbox, and it's fantastic for some use cases, but it's terrible at some others. So AI is first about understanding what are the things you can put together. There might be a bit of machine learning to begin with. You might leverage large language models to harmonize or consolidate or normalize data that is heterogeneous and cluster the data and do these kind of things. So first you need to understand what kind of AI is good for what part of your process. But what we've seen as a make or break factor in how AI can be helpful is the quality of the underlying data. Because there is this notion of if you have good data, AI will amplify the quality of your data and make it even more useful, even faster, so that you can make better, faster, and more effective decisions. But if your underlying data is bad, that can have catastrophic effect and blow back into your face sooner that you realize, because you need to understand what AI is, and there's a lot of mathematics there and probability. And so if your underlying data is wrong or bad, well, you will train a model with bad data, and what it will do is regurgitate all of that, amplify that bad data. So we tend to urge our client to think about the level of data quality they have before we start layering AI on top of that. But clearly it's the elephant in the room these days. So yeah, but the amount of use cases is absolutely fascinating. And once you start surfacing a data-based risk factor on the supplier, the ability of Gen AI tools to actually dive deeper into that risk factor is fascinating. And when you single out a category or a supplier, it becomes very easy to instruct a ChatGPT or a Claude or a Gemini to actually go and dig more data, build better or other correlations to look for the latest news coverage for that supplier and actually say, okay, that is actually relevant, or okay, maybe it was a false positive. So it helps just bring so much more context than it used to be possible before. That's a massive boon for people who want to address risk in their supply chain, because suddenly, yeah, you have access to data and correlations that were not available before.
And what about the idea that procurement's role is obviously evolving fast? So do you think it's getting the boardroom attention it deserves?
It has the boardroom attention it deserves. The question is, has procurement finally cracked the nut on how to be the one responding to these questions? And I think it's becoming better and better, because procurement is getting better as a function and has managed to elevate its role in the eye of the C-suite or the boardroom. But we can do better. And we used to be seen as a steward of cost. And so when people needed to improve EBITDA, well, they would generally come naturally to procurement for help. We need to be stewards of risk and resiliency. Little by little, we're getting there. And very often, procurement is reporting into supply chain. And supply chain is really about making all of that hum. I see procurement as the interface between the company and the outside world. So we need to be positioned as such, because we should be the scouts, the people who know what's happening on the market. We should be the informer of the business to tell them, hey, this is happening. Maybe we should be doing something. So I guess that we're getting a lot better at getting boardroom attention, but we can still do better. And I've hinted at that earlier. The moment we stop thinking, or not only think in terms of cost and risk, but in terms of materiality of the impact for the business, I think this is where we'll not only get the attention, but actually the buy-in from the boardroom. And that's where they will actually proactively come to us to not only fix issues, but prevent them from happening.
Okay. And are you seeing let's say, a cultural shift in how companies view supplier relationships, shifting from transactional to more strategic?
Yes, but I'm always mindful of talking about strategic supplier relationship, because you can only have so many strategic suppliers. And I believe that there is a happy medium for the largest part of your supply chain, which is treating suppliers not only as transactional people that you can hammer from time to time to reduce your costs, but as people, well, decent human being with whom you have a decent conversation and can discuss based on facts. And one of the things that is often overlooked in my view is that we're talking about outside risks. We've talked about them in the past half hour, but very often there are self-inflicted risks with a supplier. I mean, when you look at private company, the financial health has decreased significantly since 2019. And a lot of that is due to the volatility in the economic market, but a lot of that is also due to late payment terms. I mean, there was a stat in Europe where 25% of bankruptcies were caused directly by late payments. Who's responsible for that? You are responsible for that. So pay your supplier on time. That's one way to drastically limit the financial risk on your supplier. And there are a lot of things are like that. If you want to reduce your operational risk, start trusting a bit better your supplier on their operating model. Because the moment you start asking them for bespoke things that are outside of their industrial framework, you're putting them at risk of not being able to fulfill their SLA. But down the road, you're putting yourself at risk. Talking about relationship with suppliers, I think that one thing we're starting to see a bit more, and maybe I'm biased with the software as a service world, is that companies start to trust a bit more the suppliers into challenging them on their way of working, their ways of doing, and they fit more into an industrial model that is just here to reduce the risk down the road. So I think that if I see a shift, it's in this. It's more equal relationship, more trusted relationship on what's the right way to do business together. Because if you agree on that and if everybody finds their way of working, it will be easier and you will reduce the risk of working together. So that's for me a significant trend we're seeing today.
Okay. And if you had a magic wand, what's the one thing you'd fix today to make supply chains more resilient and sustainable?
That's a hard one. I guess so. I said that earlier. You will not avoid disruptions, especially these days. But the question is, how fast can we detect them and how prepared are we to fix them? So the magic wand would be to have enough data, fresh enough data of the right quality to actually surface these things, and so that you can reduce the time it takes to realize something wrong happened, so that you can fix that. Yeah, it would be on the availability and quality of the data to react to the disruptions that you cannot avoid.
Okay. And a left field question. If you could have any person or character, alive or dead, real or fictional, as a champion for sustainable supply chains or resilient supply chains, who would it be and why?
That's a good one. I would actually probably choose an anti-hero. There's this book from Balzac about this rich guy who decides that he will invent the philosopher's stone that turns lead into gold. And this guy just goes crazy, takes his whole family bankrupt because he's looking for that chimera. And I think that this is something that is a cautionary tale basically for procurement is stop chasing your tail. Think in terms of the business on what has an impact, what is achievable, and go for that. Don't try to have that thing, that unreachable goal, because you don't have all it takes. You will kill yourself and you will impact your business. Yeah. I don't know if you expected a positive aspect or a cautionary tale, but that would be one.
Okay, great. Are there any books, movies, documentaries you found particularly inspiring when thinking about sustainability or leadership?
And there might be a link to recent events on where I live, but there is this book called It Can't Happen Here. And that's about the rise of populists to the power. But the book was written in 1932 or 38. And that's very interesting because risk is real and you need to see it. And not everything might be as it looks. And for me, this is a very important thing. And that applies to procurement specifically is you need to use your judgment. Critical thinking is absolutely mandatory these days because, again, you're seeing a lot of things. But I'm coming back to that is how relevant is that for you and for your business? Are you over-indexing on things that have no impact? Or are you not seeing things that will actually blow up to your face and basically stop your company from doing business? So the thing about recognizing what is a real risk from the other and not thinking it can't happen here, that's probably a good one.
We're coming towards the end of the podcast now, Pierre. Is there any question I haven't asked that you wish I had, or any aspect of this we haven't covered that you think it's important for people to be aware of?
I think we've covered a lot of ground and we've talked about being prepared, having the data. I think that the other thing that people need to be aware of is how do I structure my ways of working so that whenever we see something that requires our attention, we execute upon that. We plan as much as we can. We monitor the progress of whatever action we do. And more importantly, we track the impact it has on the business. Because very often we're talking about insights, analytics, and stuff like that. And we stop at saying, hey, there's a pattern here or something happens. That's fine. But you need to take it to the end of the line and act on that and make sure that you've acted in a way that has a positive impact on the business. I would say that would be the closing thought for me is finding out about risk is one thing. Actually working towards solving the problems is something very different and very important.
Okay, great. Pierre, if people would like to know more about yourself or any of the things we discussed in the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
So I would direct them to our website, spendhq.com, where you will find a lot of white paper, especially around risk, around sustainability in procurement. There's a trove of resources here to educate yourself on those matters. And please feel free to reach out directly to me on LinkedIn. So I'm Pierre Laprée, and I will be happy to have any conversation on those topics because, as you can see, I like to talk about them.
Good. Fantastic. Pierre, that's been great. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Tom.